Right, well, we'll begin shortly. We're going to be talking about Quentin Skinner and Michel Foucault's approaches to intellectual history, how they differ, what the similarities are between their genealogical approaches. Lovely. But yeah, we'll just give it a moment. I don't know if anyone's joined on YouTube, but we'll just give it a moment. But yeah, we're going through Skinner and Foucault's approaches to intellectual history, and of course, any questions along the way that anyone will have. I'll give it until maybe past. Should probably actually put him in here as well. We'll be going soon, but I'm just going to give it until past for anyone to join. Right, there. We're going to give it until past for people to join before we go through Foucauldian and Skinnerian approaches to intellectual history. So yeah, just a little while yet, but we'll give it until past, and that's when we'll begin comparing Skinnerian and Foucauldian approaches to reading history. So stick with us for another 8 minutes or so, or come back, fetch yourself a drink. And yeah, we're going to go through Skinner and Foucault, two pivotal figures in the process of understanding intellectual history. Can't tell if anyone's on there. We'll be going shortly. Favourite era of history, Barry? Well, the Enlightenment for me. So anything from the mid-17th century through to the mid-18th century, that period that we call the Enlightenment. So 1650, coming out of the wars of religion, coming out of the English Civil War in Britain, where thinking really gets off the ground, where you've got Newtonian thought in the sciences, where you've got the legacy of people like Francis Bacon, but you've also got the emergence of people on the continent like Jean-Jacques Rousseau going into the 18th century. Rousseau, Voltaire, critical thinking, casting off the age of dogma, the age of religion, and really becoming the age of reason in the space of about 100 years. That's mainly what my PhD looks at, the emergence of religious toleration out of religious conflict and sectarian conflict. I'm just trying to see whether I can set this up on the computer as well, but it seems to be struggling with my technological ability to do that. Thank you, Barry. I'm glad you appreciated the answer, but we'll get going properly in 3 minutes' time. I don't seem to be able to set it up. I'm almost there in terms of setting it up on the computer simultaneously, which is pretty impressive for my technological ability. There we are, that's saved. Oh, right, here we are. Hello. I've clicked go live on the computer, so we might be doing that alongside. Hello, JD Pearson. We should be going shortly. There we are. Right. With 2 minutes to spare. It looks like that's doing it on the computer likewise. Trying to expand that. No comments yet. Okay. So we're live on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. I would do TikTok as well simultaneously, but I don't have enough devices to be able to do that. Anyway, I'm not sure. I don't know whether I can actually see who's in the call all at once. I think I can see the barriers. So yeah, I'm glad you like that answer. But yeah, so intellectual history is essentially the study of ideas, the study of contextualizing philosophical ideas, and specifically political thought. Often you'll see that intellectual history is a study combined of intellectual history and political thought. But yeah, we've got people joining on YouTube and on Facebook, so I'll give it just another minute and then we'll get going properly. Daniel. Three people in there. Okay, it's about time, so there we are, turn that off. Right, so I'm just going to do a little through of the main methodologies to intellectual history. So in the last SAMS seminar that I did, we looked at what is intellectual history. Now, if you weren't there for that, intellectual history is, the study of ideas in context. It was forged out of the Second World War with historians of the Cambridge School, based at the University of Cambridge, who wanted to take away very sort of nationalistic history writing that had come all the way through kind of Whiggish history in Britain in particular, but all across Europe, you had very nationalist portrayals of the way that history was written and therefore understood, which the intellectual historians of the 1960s saw as leading to the conflicts of the First World War, and ultimately, when it came to the Second World War, in the wake of obviously finding out about the Holocaust and finding out about the terrible catastrophe that happened in the Second World War, you had a lot of historians who were trying to kind of plot a route to the Second World War, and try and say that people like Plato, people like Rousseau, people like Herder and various kind of political theorists throughout history led up to the Second World War, and the intellectual historians said this was wrong. You can't try and create some kind of long chain of ideas that lead to certain events. The intellectual historian said that's bad history. The only way we can understand theorists and ideas are actually within their own setting, within their own context. We can understand parallel histories. We can understand, take an example like what I look at in religious toleration. You can take a setting where ideas were developed and you can make a parallel comparison to a time. So if the elements of the debate around toleration where there had been a period of religious strife between communities, and perhaps if we saw that today, we could make a comparison. And then what I'm looking at, which is how did toleration emerge out of a really bloody and polarized century in the 17th century? How did that transform into a religiously tolerant society in the 18th century? I can't say that the scholars that I'm looking at led to a society that we know today, but what I can say is they were addressing some of the similar issues, perhaps, that we are addressing in a polarized world today, and therefore try and get some perspective on how history might provide an answer, not by saying that things lead up to today, because that can be quite dangerous. That can be what the original intellectual historians were worried about in terms of looking at the way that historians had written history up to the Second World War. But actually, we can create parallels between historical moments and thereby try and understand the historical moment we're living in with a better understanding from those prior examples. However, today, I'm going to move on from that because that's what we looked at last time. And today we're going to look at actually the methodologies. Now, the methodologies of intellectual history are known as genealogies. Now, this is a word that I sometimes would struggle with in my seminars up at St Andrews when I was doing my master's. Is it genealogy? Genealogy? It's a confusing one a bit. It's L-O-G-Y. Genealogy or something. Now, if any of you have read Michel Foucault, you would know the idea of genealogies. But we're going to look at Skinner first, because Quentin Skinner is the quintessential intellectual historian. He is the founder of the Cambridge School. He's sort of what most people, if they've ever heard of intellectual history, would have heard of Skinner rather than anyone else. You have got Pocock, who some people also may have heard of, even if they don't know very much about intellectual history. But Skinner is the one that you would most likely have heard of. Now, what we're going to look at, we're going to explore the two different figures, Skinner and Foucault. Both are scholars who offer very distinct methods of interpreting history, focusing on how ideas, in Skinner's case, and institutions, in Foucault's case, evolve. Now let's look at Skinner's approach first. Let's tackle him, as he is the daddy of intellectual history. So the genealogy of the modern state. Now, Skinner challenges the idea of a consistent or shared conceptualization of the state over time. But so what does he mean by this? Now, this is his famous lecture that he gives as well about the genealogy of the modern state, Skinner. And he says that the idea of the state as we know it, now, drop a comment in the chat or whatever, but the way that we would understand the state, this is a really, really good example of understanding like what we do in intellectual history. Now, today, we would probably take the word the state and we'd think, in Britain, the NHS or the police or the fire service or, public services. That's what we think of as the state. Or perhaps some people would think of the sort of bastion of the state idea that it's kind of, the Department of Work and Pensions. It's about taxation. It's about providing benefits. The state is there as a kind of support mechanism. But actually, obviously, we know that state obviously didn't mean that 400 years ago. So what Skinner is doing here is taking a very simple term and saying, look how ideas develop. You can't just say that there's some like similarity across different ages, that the birth of the modern state was in the first time when the word state was used, because it wasn't. It meant something completely different. Never had any idea that it was going to develop to mean the welfare state or public institutions or anything like that. Originally, when the state was first used, it either referred to a geographical conception, so referring to a state, a space, or it's also possible that its kind of initial use was the idea of kind of the body politic, the very famous kind of Hobbesian idea of that Leviathan king sitting on the front of the frontispiece of Leviathan and making up the people. So we've got two things there. We've got the idea of a king, essentially, a ruler is the state, and then we've got the idea of a geographical state. So those would have been the kind of initial ways that politics would have been understood when referring to the state. That then develops, the state changes, so to speak. It moves from being a king to perhaps being a set of institutions. So the state itself isn't really evolving. The state, we can't say that our modern state has come from the idea that the state was a king. However, the meaning of the state is changing over time and being used again and again and again. So there were lots of different options in the way that the state could have developed. It could have gone down a kind of purely referential path to just meaning a nation. It could have gone down to just being the king, but then that seems a bit odd, doesn't it? That doesn't really seem like the state to us. We wouldn't think the monarch is the state. Maybe you would, but I mean, that seems a bit strange. So then a century on from that period, we see the term state getting used to refer to military institutions, to refer to parliament. But actually, institutions almost feel a bit limiting. You do actually need that geographical element, of the expanse of the state, really to refer to the state, surely. Because just saying the institutions, that kind of limits it. So are we not elements of the state? Is it only the institutions, the arms of government that are the state? So Skinner really develops this, and he takes it all the way up to the modern day, where he says that, today the state refers to, political institutions, democratic participation. But this wasn't a linear evolution, I think, is the point that we're trying to get across here. There was never a kind of linear, kind of one sort of perennial state. The state is always changing. So to say that these ideas are consistent and to try and kind of like draw some grand link about how there's always been this idea of the state, and that we can kind of read back and go, oh, well, if Locke or Hobbes was referring to the state, they had a similar conception of the idea of the state, and therefore we can kind of understand their political arguments within our own modern language, is completely for the birds. The state is always changing, just like any other political term is changing. What does liberty mean? This is another one that Skinner addresses in a separate interview, which he does with the Institute for Historical Research. Talking about Locke, you really need to delve into Locke's understanding, his psychology, to understand what he meant by liberty, because liberty isn't something that's being passed down through the generations. We like to read it that way because it, if you're a liberal, it makes you feel quite warm to think that there's this eternal kind of evolution of liberal ideas. But actually, liberty itself changes over time. Liberty for who? Liberty how far? Liberty meaning freedom to, freedom from, Liberty is a complicated term in itself. So Skinner says, you need to understand liberty not as some kind of monolithic kind of concept, but something that's always changing, always in flux. You might as well have liberty 1, liberty 2, liberty 3, because there is no one definition of liberty in intellectual history. Liberty could be freedom from, freedom to, liberty for who. It's not something that we can just rely on to kind of reassure ourselves that kind of, we've been on a nice trajectory of liberalizing over time. Actually, these things have lots of different options, and at every moment in history, there's a new route that a development of the definition of liberty could take. It's never been one linear trajectory, just as I was saying that the state has never had it. The state was the monarch, the state could have been a geographical state, it could have been the institutions, it could have been the people. The state has redefined itself over time. That's what intellectual history is for. It's to say, look, we always live at a moment where these definitions can change. We can't reassure ourselves that we know what these people were talking about. We really have to investigate their use of the term and what they could have understood as the term, rather than our own kind of anachronistic reading of how we understand the term today, to really get to the heart of the political arguments that they were trying to have, because then we can make a comparison with their political arguments and context to the political arguments we're having today and the contexts we live in today. So that's one element of Skinner's thought. Then you've got the genealogical method. So unlike Foucault, who also has a genealogical method, Skinner's genealogy is not primarily concerned with power relations. So when you look at someone like Foucault, who I'm sure lots of people who have either studied politics or history or any kind of social sciences come across, the idea of genealogy is very much linked to understanding how people and ideas I am George, yes. The idea of Foucault's kind of genealogy is to try and understand how things are operating within different power dynamics. So to try and trace where the power is coming from, that then influences ideas. That idea of cultural hegemony, that idea of kind of where is the dominating power. But for Skinner, the genealogy, as I've said, is a linguistic one. It's to go, right, well, where did the term start? What was one way that it could have developed? What was another? This also makes it extraordinarily difficult for an intellectual historian if you want to try and analyze political thought in another language, because all we've addressed here is trying to understand political terms within English. So you get a lot of very orthodox intellectual historians, a lot of the professors that I knew, who were very, very against the idea of you ever reading anything in translation, because obviously if we're talking about the state or liberty and not knowing what was meant in the past compared to how we might understand that term today, obviously reading a translation adds a whole another element of complication to understanding those political terms. So Skinner's method focuses on tracing the historical origins and development of ideas and concepts in institutions, tracking that sort of non-linear trajectory, the offshoots, the ways that it could have gone, the ways that it did develop and maybe then stopped developing and then tacked in a different direction. He sort of talks about this idea of semantic drift as well, which sounds a bit sort of postmodern. But again, it's essentially that terms change over time. And we need to recognize that, because we might actually be unaware of it. That we might be using a conception of liberty or conception of socialism or conception of conservatism or whatever we're talking about, but mainly kind of ideas like liberty, like tolerance, like freedom, like tradition, but we need to be very aware to the fact that even within a year, but certainly within a decade and certainly within a century, there's semantic drift to these terms, and that different people are using it. I can see it when I'm studying religious toleration and particularly in the chapter I'm doing on John Brown at the moment. Just prior to when he's writing, toleration is a purely negative term. 1690s and definitely before that, toleration is seen as something something fundamentally flawed in a country. Oh, you're tolerating. Why are you doing that? You're making your country pregnable to attack. You're letting in dissidents. You're letting in those who want to be at war with us. Those who want to betray us from the inside. Toleration was seen as something you either had to, stamp out, essentially, because some saw it as completely heretical to allow dissidents and dissonant thinking different to one's own. But then by the time Brown's writing in the 1720s, and particularly with the kind of emergence of Enlightenment discourse in the 18th century, toleration flips. It doesn't flip immediately. It sort of becomes what we still know as one understanding of toleration, which is this kind of slightly negative term. It's like, oh, well, I'll tolerate that. I'm a vegetarian. I will tolerate you eating meat next to me or whatever. Like, I don't love it, but that's fine. But then also the idea of tolerance becomes a positive. By the sort of 1750s, you've got Voltaire writing about how beautiful tolerance is in London. That you've got Muslims, Christians, and Jews all trading together and have no animosity, no hatred of one another, because they're all there for a common purpose and working together. And tolerance by then has become a very positive thing. So this is that idea of semantic drift, and that semantic drift can actually happen extremely quickly. So you have to be wary of that, particularly within tumultuous political periods where things are chopping and changing a lot. Skinner also addresses populist views of the state. He examines how the state has been personified and its implications for legal and political theory, such in the idea of things like sovereign debt. So he takes this idea that, well, what is the state? Well, perhaps it's something like the debt that's passed down through generations. He wants to find these kind of pure examples of where there are shared kind of historical understandings of something that's kind of related to the state. And sovereign debt, it's only recently that we've paid off the debts for the wars in America, and the kind of conflicts there. So sovereign debt's been something that's been managed by the state for so long, and he sees that as something that could be a shared comparison point, that it's developed to the idea of the state being sovereign debt. So there are all these different ideas of how you understand a concept, you see. So we've got semantic drift, we've got the genealogical method, we've addressed these kind of ideas of populist views of the state, so things like sovereign debt. And now we want to have a look at Michel Foucault's approach, because we've addressed Skinner. We've gone through that. So we've gone through the idea that his genealogy is a semantic one. It's the understanding of language. It's the understanding of taking a term and then looking at how it's been understood through each historical moment. But now, and I'm sure some of you will be dreading it, we're going to turn to Foucault. Now, I'm sure you've come across Foucault, whether you're studying history, politics, geography, any sort of social science. We are going to look at his genealogy, which you would have heard of. You would have heard of his genealogy and his archaeology. And he has a critical genealogy. Foucault's genealogy is a method of deconstruction. This is what we see with postmodernists, the deconstructive method, focusing on how power relations shape ideas. So who's in control? Who's got the authority? Who can assert what things mean? And that's how he sees the development of concepts and ideas, that they're shaped by those with authority. So liberty is something defined by the emerging middle class when it comes to the Enlightenment. This is his big critique, you see, because a lot of the kind of, semi-left-wing commentators after the Enlightenment wanted to say, well, it was power being completely ripped from the rich and powerful and given to the working class. Obviously, that didn't really happen. We didn't see a equitable society suddenly emerge after the Enlightenment, and obviously after the French Revolution as that big kind of year zero turning point. So we didn't see that. So Foucault wants to say, well, actually, This is because it was actually ultimately a kind of middle class sort of preserve who managed to define what liberty meant. They were the ones who got some liberty. So they said, well, actually, yeah, no, society was really, really free after the Enlightenment, after the French Revolution, etc., because they were the ones with enough power to be able to define it. And actually, he says that there's still an upper class there. You know, the power hasn't moved. It's just transitioned into a new ruling elite. So unlike Skinner, we're not just looking at terms in and of themselves and how they have changed. We're looking at how power is transitioning before we then try and understand a term, you see. So that's his critical genealogy, however we want to pronounce it. There are power dynamics in history. We know this, and Foucault is obsessed with it. Foucault views history as a battleground where power struggles are consistently playing out. It's a perennial thing for him. Power struggles are always playing out, as I say, whether it's in defining concepts, defining institutions, defining historical moments, it's always defined by those with power. And yeah, using that example of liberty again, that was a transition from a ruling elite to another ruling elite, as far as he's concerned. Society was not liberated by Enlightenment or French Revolution. It was simply a passing of power from one elite to another elite. And he would say the same thing about various revolutions throughout history and various kind of political movements. He has that famous phrase to break into history to try and change it. But ultimately, unless you do that, which he sees as he wants to see that happening in Iran, and obviously we now know the trajectory that Iran has taken, but he really wants to see that breakaway. He wants to see an actual cut into history to break that power transition, because he thinks that the way that politics is understood, and the way, particularly when we apply it to intellectual history, political ideas are understood, is that they are defined by the elite, which is always there. There's always those with power, and they will define it, and they will make themselves look good. They will make it look like liberty has passed and freed everyone, or they'll make it look like society is tolerant. But who are the ones who are now being, who are the ones in power who either want to define themselves as tolerant, or, if you look at it the other way, those without power will be saying, can you tolerate us, please? And those with power will be saying no. So we can see how power defines what these terms mean. If you have no power, you want to be tolerated. But also later, if you do have power, you want to be seen as tolerant. You don't want to be seen as brutal, particularly if you're a democracy or a kind of modernizing liberal society. You don't want to be seen as brutal. So you want to define yourselves as tolerant. Are you actually tolerant, or are you the one with the power who's saying you are tolerant? Or are you the one with no power saying you want to be tolerated? These are the ways that power reflects how terms are defined at different points in history. So we've got that. We've also got the deconstruction of myths, okay? So Foucault argues that history is not about uncovering an objective truth. We talked about this quite extensively last time, and I got quite passionate about it, but it's not about uncovering an objective truth, but about debunking myths that maintain power structures. So these kind of, again, sort of ideas that that there has been some kind of transition, that there has been some kind of great sort of liberalization and freeing of the populace. He wants to say, well, if that hasn't happened, we need to debunk those myths, and we need to look at where power still lies. In our modern society, do we live in a free country? Or, take Britain, well, there's still members of the House of Lords who are hereditary peers, for example. As much as we want to say that power is evolving and, we're a democratic country, we're a free country, we're an equal country, we're a just country, where are those myths that we tell ourselves because of the way that Whiggish history, in the British case, is written to say that we're on a path of progress? The Whigs are obsessed with writing history in this kind of progressivist notion. But where have secret little sort of power structures still managed to define the way that we understand political discourse in Britain, in Europe, in the world? Okay. He also has a critique of liberty, which I've sort of gone on extensively through describing Foucault and his understanding of terms and history. But his critique of liberty suggests that concepts like liberty were developed to shift domination from feudal elites to a more modern business ruling class during the Enlightenment. Okay, the Enlightenment wasn't about going out and wanting to help your common man. He doesn't believe that Rousseau or Voltaire or Diderot had any particular care for the peasant in the street. He says that actually all they served to do was to kind of make everything feel a little bit nicer and a little bit warmer and raise the concerns of an emerging middle class, and actually move the power that used to lie with a very small, admittedly, group of feudal lords to a slightly broader subsection of society, but would tell themselves that they were doing this. They would tell themselves that they were doing this for the benefit of the nation, but actually that's a myth, okay? That liberty wasn't extended to all people. Obviously, we know that. And actually, this is quite a common way of us understanding things now, because we've got quite a kind of critical lens on history these days. So we know it. But what Foucault was saying was quite profound, that actually these, what before him was seen as the revolutionaries, the enlighteners, weren't enlighteners at all. They're actually just a puppet of maintaining the status quo, really, but just moving power from one small group of people to another small group of people, which, yeah, when you think about it, the emergence of modern society has really rotated around a very small group of people, regardless of revolutions or enlightenment or any kind of aspect of what we see as transformation of society. Obviously, those moments transform society, but actually who was defining how free, how democratic, how tolerant, how compassionate, how just a society was? It was those with the power. So they could define their legacy, their history, their inheritance, but also their future. They could define all of these things by making the terms, by defining what liberty was, what democracy was, what justice was. It was those with power who were able to make those political terminologies. And that's what Foucault wants us to look at and go, right, so obviously there's a shared element with Skinner. It's very linguistic. It's very looking at how do terms develop. But there's that added element of, but why are people doing it? Who is doing it? And how much authority and power did those people have? What are they trying to cover up, perhaps? So debunk the myth. Right, I'm just going to have a sip of my drink. And then we'll move on to comparing Skinner and Foucault here. What have we got on the Facebook and the YouTube? No comments on there. Anything on there? Anything on there? Right. We've been going for 40 minutes. That's all good. Right, let's go down to compare then Skinner and Foucault. Well, we've got context, yeah, with Skinner. So we got that. And we've got power when it comes to Foucault, okay? So Skinner emphasizes the historical context and evolving meanings of concepts, while Foucault focuses on how power relations drive the development of ideas, okay? So we've got context, power relations. Now, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I think for a good intellectual historian, I think it's worthy to try and understand both. You want a bit of context, you want a bit of understanding of power relations. So I think those two things synthesize quite nicely if you combine Skinner and Foucault's genealogical approaches. Truth in history. Foucault challenges the notion of fixed truth in history, arguing for the continual excavation of underlying power dynamics. But this is very similar to Skinner again, because he doesn't accept that there's one definition of terms. He doesn't accept that there's one liberty, one state. The state has always redefined itself throughout history, except he's just saying that that's more to do. That's almost more being a I suppose, an emergence of its own time, whereas Foucault is saying there is actually something slightly sinister underlying it, which is that these terms, the state, liberty, democracy, justice, they're all being defined by a elite who have the power. So I think a balance of both is really useful for the intellectual historian to understand the context in which the term is emerging, but to also be aware that even regardless of the context, these terms are defined by those who maintain the power. And therefore, why do they want to express a term as it was defined at the time? So that's truth in history. How do we understand these terms? What to be true, how to define things. Genealogy's purpose. For Skinner, genealogy helps understand the evolution of ideas. For Foucault, it reveals how these ideas have been manipulated for control and domination. Okay, so for Skinner, it's more of an exploration, and I quite like seeing it that way. My blog's called Explorations in Intellectual History. I quite like seeing intellectual history as an exploration, but also you do have to be, and this is a very sort of a very postmodern idea as well, but there's no innocent reading of these things. We have a responsibility as a historian, just as any investigator into any subject, we have a responsibility to say, well, who is developing these things and for what purpose? And could there have been some misdemeanors, some selfish interest at play in the way that these political terminologies were utilized? So, yeah, I was just trying to think, who am I thinking of there? There's no innocent reading of history. It's very, I'm not going to remember him now. It'll come to me, I'm sure. But there's no innocent reading of history, essentially. So, yeah, there we are. You can't enjoy history innocently. You have to be critical. You have to look through it with the lens of there's an ideology at work in every way that any term, any political terminology, any political structure was developed, any institution, any concept. There was always something at play to develop that term. Along with the context, there was also a power dynamic that created that because it was a useful thing to maintain power. Okay. So let's look at applications in contemporary cultural debates. So Skinner's perspective, applying Skinner's method, we can analyze historical context and semantic drift of terms like identity and justice, allowing for more nuanced discussions. So when we look at the kind of polarized world that we live in today, I've just done a video on this earlier on, where we look at, say, that battle of woke, anti-woke. Skinner would say, well, let's look at these ideas. Let's look at justice. Let's look at identity. How has identity been understood in the past, in the 18th century, 19th century? He would say, look at it at the decade, because as I was saying earlier, these terms can drift extremely quickly in terms of how these terms like identity are understood. Okay, so in my study, toleration is changing within a year, within a decade. The understanding of what toleration means is really, really changing within the populace. So he would say, well, we have to be aware about how when people refer to identity in the modern age, they're referring to identity in a very different way to even their preceding, counterparts by a decade. The way we express identity, understand identity, is changing very, very quickly. So all parties should be aware that some will be perhaps confused about the change of identity, that some will want to change identity more quickly, will want to express their identity in different ways. So the point I'm trying to make here is that intellectual history has a relevance to even these sort of debates that we're having today, because it's trying to be more considerate to the fact that there is no objective definition set in stone of these terms. And actually a lot of the kind of political debates that arise from these historical discussions are often quite artificial, because they don't take into account the fact that everything's changing at the time. Obviously the context changing, therefore the idea is changing. If we then add in Foucault, power is exerting itself to define, what identity means. Those who are reactionary want to say, well, you don't have the right to express your identity like that, because they feel affronted that what they see as their identity is being stolen from them. These are the kind of things where intellectual history is really interesting to analyze on all sides of political divides, why there's such controversy, and perhaps how we can try and help resolve these sorts of things, and resolve the polarization. So that's a little bit of Skinner's approach to it. If we look at Foucault's perspective on contemporary cultural debates, from Foucault's viewpoint, we examine the power and the structures embedded into society and into these debates, and we recognize how truth is constructed, to maintain dominance. So again, this idea of identity and justice, let's take those two examples and carry them forward. So in these kind of culture war eras that we live in, Foucault would say, well, who's stoking the culture war? Who's labeling who? So they'd be saying, he'd be saying to us, take the idea of expressing identity. Well, who's telling you that you can't express your identity in the way you want to? Why are they doing that? These sort of far-right fanatics that we see these days who are saying that a man's a man and all this kind of hyper-masculine sort of stuff. He'd be saying, but it's actually irrelevant, the kind of politics that they're discussing, but he'd be saying, why do they want to have a stranglehold over expression of identity? What's sort of leading them to want to have that stranglehold over the definition of that political concept of identity? And it's because they are threatened by the slipping away of identity. If you want to get very existentialist about it, you could say they feel personally threatened. They feel like their identity is being zapped, taken away from them because other people are questioning it. But you could also say that it's just a maintenance of the status quo and a broader idea that, they want to have control over political definition, why heterosexual men want to maintain power and grip over definitions and the way we understand the world. So that's what Foucault would say about the development of ideas, and this is why intellectual history is so important, because we can understand these terms, we can try and bring together the different sides by understanding these terms, looking at the context, looking at how these things are being defined, where they've come from, and then that's the Skinnerian approach, as I've been detailing, and then add the Foucauldian approach of why are people trying to define things as they are? Why are people trying to control ideas, control concepts, control definitions? And if we do that, we might start to get actually a slightly more nuanced understanding of the controversies, polarizations, political debates that we face today, if we use intellectual historical method to understand them. So let's round up with some concluding insights, right? So both Skinner and Foucault challenge traditional linear approaches to history, encouraging a view of history as dynamic and constantly evolving, right? Their approaches highlight the importance of understanding both the cultural context and the power dynamics in interpreting historical events and concepts. These insights, I think, at least, are valuable for engaging in modern cultural debates. There is a relevance to intellectual history. It's not just for us kind of fanatics over political thought and who get very romantic over these things. It has a relevance to the political debates of our day, to make it more nuanced, to make it more informative, and actually to make it a little bit perhaps less polarized, and actually to appreciate that lots of things are changing all of the time. And this isn't a new thing. This isn't something that our generation is facing for the first time, that think that the world moves quickly. Actually, definitions, people, political understandings change very, very quickly throughout history. And it's bad history writing, and actually just bad kind of, learning, if you can't understand that definitions are being used, that terms are being used with different meanings and definitions throughout history. And if we can grasp that, read people's understandings of liberty, freedom, justice, democracy, the world over, and even just within our own national context, if we can understand that people mean different things by those different terms, try and break down what they mean, we actually might find a little bit more cohesion as well. Okay, so these insights are valuable for engaging in modern culture debates with a critical and informed perspective, right? So those are both Foucault and Skinner's approaches to intellectual history. We've looked at the genealogies, we've compared them against each other, we've applied them to modern cultural debates. If you have any other questions about intellectual history, it doesn't have to be about what I've just discussed. I'll hang around here for a few more minutes. But yeah, you can ask me anything about the study, about how you'd probably start reading about intellectual history if you had any interest in that, reading any particular historical periods. But yeah, otherwise, I will leave it there. But if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. It would be lovely to hear from you. But yeah, I'm just going to pour a little bit more of my drink. Great stuff. And this will be, I'll post this whole video. It's about almost an hour, but I'll post all of this so that people can go back to it as well. You're about 18 years, not very well versed on history or culture. How would you begin? I mean, I suppose it really depends kind of where you want to go with it. I think the first text that really influenced me was reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract when I was about 16, because it really kind of opens your mind up to a lot of political thinking within, actually, I think the text's only about 90 pages. But that's like going straight into political thought. If you wanted to look at, understanding history or culture, I suppose any book on the Enlightenment, I would say, because our modern world really does evolve from the Enlightenment, the century that I'm studying for the PhD, from the 1650s to the 1750s. That is the turning point of the Dark Ages, the feudal period, power being consolidated within a very few people, to something that resembles our modern society a little bit more. I would recommend my former professor, John Robertson. He was my tutor at St Andrews. He's the author of, I'm sure you've seen them before, the Very Short Introductions. So the AVSI Oxford publications. I'd read The Enlightenment, A Very Short Introduction. It's just a great way to kind of introduce yourself to a bit of history, a bit of culture, a bit of politics, all wrapped up within kind of the birth of modernity. But talking about the birth of modernity, there are plenty of other really good books and audio books that you can get about the Enlightenment. Richie Robertson, not a family member of John Robertson, and you don't have to be a Robertson to write on the Enlightenment, but Richie Robertson has a book called The Enlightenment and the Pursuit of Happiness, which is actually it's a long book, so I'd recommend the AVSI more, as it's only 90 pages. But you can listen to Richie Robertson's The Enlightenment and the Pursuit of Happiness, and it's just a really nicely written book for someone who maybe hasn't come at kind of historical writing, and particularly sort of political history or political theory writing before. He writes it very sort of, you can read a chapter before bed and it's just quite enjoyable. It's kind of, talking, one chapter's on witches. You wouldn't think that would be in a kind of work about political thought, but it's just talking about how the world was in the 17th century and then how suddenly the Enlightenment, literally Lumiere, lit up the world and changed it from those kind of superstitious dark ages to the kind of modern age that we are still part of now. Okay. But then that's me talking about the Enlightenment. If you wanted to read about intellectual history, for example, there is Richard Watmore's What is Intellectual History? So that's actually a book on how to read history well, essentially, how to look at ideas, look at politics. That's a book about the methodology of reading history. About culture, I mean, there's probably nowhere better you could start. This might be my cynical perspective, but there's probably nowhere better you could start than maybe even reading some stuff on the existentialists. I mean, I think that's always quite a fun way to broach reading about culture, like reading Camus' The Stranger, or reading, was it Sarah Bakewell? She wrote the Existentialist Cafe, which is again just a really fun way of kind of understanding modern political thought. So the existentialists, the sort of birth of 20th century feminism with de Beauvoir. It's quite a fun, engaging read to sort of look at politics and society quite cynically, as the existentialists do, in terms of the institutions and structures and everything. But again, it might just give you a little bit of a flavour to make you want to adventure a little bit more. But the text I read was The Social Contract. That was the first political text that I read that got me into really both politics and history, really, because I got into politics because of it, in terms of like the way that it made me feel about the world, the way that it made me feel that society is so sort of materialistic and has sort of inculcated this feeling of sort of selfishness and self-obsession, which Rousseau analyzes so perfectly, like he could be speaking to today. And also he talks about the idea of the state of nature and about where we could have been. It's very Christian. It's quite funny, as Saviel's just joined, but it's very reminiscent of a Christian past, and that's what Rousseau's seen actually as a possible kind of counter-Enlightenment figure, because he's so critical of modernity, and Enlightenment's supposed to be this modernizing project. But yeah, that kind of idea of politics really spoke to me and really gave me some kind of like idea of where I sat politically and my kind of critical view of elements of our society and elements of our politic. But it also made me interested in history, because I wanted to then explore what else was going on at Rousseau's time. And then obviously I've gone down this path for the last 70 years of doing the Enlightenment. But yeah, so that would certainly be my suggestion. But that's a long way around, really. I've gone around a whole load of texts there, so you've got a whole reading list to go forward. Does anyone else have any questions, either on Facebook or on YouTube or on Instagram or any other place that anyone's beating me in from? Of course, yeah. I'll have Jake take a look at your message. Brilliant. I hope that my knowledge will, or my suggestions will impart some knowledge on some people. I'm sure if Saviel's still listening, he's probably thinking, Jesus Christ, don't listen to Sam, it'll drive you down the route of madness. But no, I mean, if no one else has any questions, then we'll probably leave it there. But this... no words. Yeah, if no one else has any questions, we'll probably leave it there. But I will be publishing this, well, yeah, exactly an hour long, as I say it, an hour, there we are. I'll be publishing this hour-long Sam seminar. They're already all in, Sam. I'm sorry, it's too late. Thank you for listening to Sam's seminar, the second one, and I'll be publishing it. We've looked at Foucault and Skinner and their genealogies of reading history. And I'm going to be trying to do these a little bit more regularly because I do enjoy it. So yeah, thank you very much indeed, and have a great rest of the evening. Cheers.